I guess the question that I do get asked quite a bit is, I guess, what would the difference be? Because it's pretty hard to sort of work out the difference. But what if we had, scenario A, where your athlete, for example, was to just basically move to closer to peak dose to start with and run that. I think the old mentality was, take it all and take it all for a period of time, versus titrating up. When we look at it from a logical standpoint, we know that if you take more from the start, you're not going to have a longer time frame to use and grow. For example, if we use growth phase as the example. However, the tissue accumulation in that time, could we equate it to the same tissue we would have, potentially accumulated over a longer period of time with less than titrating up? We do have the health side to look at, but there are those that are like, I don't care about health.
Yeah. So I think when we look at accumulating tissue over time, right, we can only accumulate tissue at a certain rate.
Yes.
And I think that understanding that leans you towards saying that the accumulation is preferable. Now, caveats. So shortened off seasons because of a contest season. So like when you're looking at pros, right? Mm-hmm. So pros that are finishing a contest season, turning around, going to compete again relatively soon. Mm-hmm. That off-season phase is going to be quite a bit shorter than the average individual. Mm-hmm. All that does for us is change the escalations. Yeah. So the escalations might be larger in amount and shorter in duration as far as how long we're running a certain dose, right? Mm-hmm. But I still think that when we look at total cumulative tissue accumulation and keeping a runway for progress, we need to be able to look at contextually how far up does a client need to accumulate a dose to. Yep. That will set the framework of the rate of progression of the dosing across the time period. Mm-hmm. What time frame do we have to work with within the season? And I think that when we look at maximizing progress, it still leans us towards accumulating doses over time. And then it's just the way that we accumulate doses is according to the time frame and the constructs that we have. And so if we use that as our construct or framework to work upon, understanding that tissue can only be laid down at a certain rate, probably have the opportunity to maximally lay down tissue at a number of doses as we progress up, still points us towards accumulating doses over time.
Yep, that's completely fair. That's a very similar response. It's just interesting to see, I guess, what different coaches would respond to with that, because I know that there are those that still wish to take, I guess, a higher dose earlier on and then just ride that escalation out. And then they realize it's like, well, I could only do it for 12 weeks. It's like, yeah, because you started at 5 grams.
Okay. Contentious topic, right? Like if you aren't in the circle that like we have, right? Yeah. And I think that the question that gets asked is, well, does this not work? And it's not that it doesn't work. Anything super physiological is going to ask tissues. It's kind of getting into the nuances of like, what can we do in order to make this athlete the best that they can be? Mm-hmm. If we ask those questions from all perspectives, so rate of progress, health metrics, and overall capacity to progress, it still leans us towards accumulating doses over time.
Yeah, exactly right. Well, I think from a logical standpoint, the longer you can grow, the better, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think too, like there's value in think of it of a training perspective too, right? Because progressions over time within a training block can go a long time with movements, right? I think that the cycling in and out of movements, shout out to Killian Hamilton here. There's a course he teaches. It's called Skill Acquisition through the Prescript kind of group. Great friends of mine, Jordan, Killian, love y'all to death. But basically the concept is just like the levels of learning that we go through, right? And through those levels of learning, we can kind of use this to frame how we learn new movement patterns.
Yes.
And we commonly see like with these new phases, especially like if we're looking at all season pushes that are 12 weeks because of the large jump in PEDs, we'll see the rotation and movement patterns happen fairly frequently. And commonly you'll see that large dose escalation with a new program.
Yep.
Right. So we get 5 weeks into the program and we're really just getting our feet wet with a movement.
Yep.
But you've only got 12 weeks to progress in super physiological, right? And so I think that it all interplays and it all intertwines, right? Like we need to have runway on all variables. And that's kind of where I'm a big proponent. And also too, looking at deloads, right? Like if we're deloading, it doesn't mean that the deload coming off of it needs to implement new movements or a new program. It just means we need to wash off fatigue and then move it up from there.
Yeah.
And I think there's some things that you can take from having an understanding of how skills are acquired. So through skill acquisition, how do we acquire the skill to perform a movement in order to lay the constructs of programming, even within bodybuilding, right? Because typically the skill acquisition conversation happens within performance settings. I think one of the biggest mistakes we can do as bodybuilders is not look at what some performance people are doing and transfer those skill sets over, right?
Yeah, 100%.
So I think that's definitely a big value to think about when we look at that.
Yeah, I guess leading into that, from a programming standpoint, how often would you potentially change a program for a client? Because I know a lot of lifestyle gen pop type clients always wanting, not always, but majority of them are usually wanting some form of change in a program more often than needed. To keep for variety's sake, I guess. With your lifters and that sort, your bodybuilders, we'll say. I'm used to using powerlifters, so lifters. Your bodybuilders, how often would you change their program if you've already set up the target, you've set up the goal, you've set up the frequency, you've set up, basically the pharmacology, you've set up nutrition, everything's ready to go, and the only thing now is that training paradigm. How often would you change a program?
So I'm gonna go at this from two directions. So the first one would be volume levels. So I will still accumulate volume over time.
Yes.
It's just the amount that I accumulate over time is not quite the same as what we would call volume accumulation based programming. So like if we look at like the U curve of response, I'm staying kind of in the peak top response area of volume accumulation. I'm not going down to the detrained and or the compensation area. And so that's changing every few weeks as far as volume levels, maybe 3 to 5 weeks. We're probably doing something from a volume perspective. Obviously within the isolation movements. When we look at like changing actual movements within a program though, I will lean towards changing auxiliary / isolation patterns first before I'm changing the major compounds.
Yes.
Mainly because when we look at mechanical tension as the main stimulus for hypertrophy, our major compounds are where we're driving a lot of that. And I don't want to spend as much time as I want to spend as least amount of time as I can learning a new skill for a major compound.
Yes.
Secondarily, single joint / auxiliary movements are often take less skill in order to do them. And so the time in which we see to acquire the skill to perform it at the highest capacity is less. So I will always lean towards changing that. And I may change the isolation patterns every 12, 14, 15 weeks. But for major compounds, man, like
run them all.
I started my off-season push for post-show in July, and I still have some of the same compound movements from July, and it's January 17th.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'd like to hear, because I am the exact same. And I think for those that are listening, probably follow a very similar model. And, if they're coaches that have clients that are always wanting or asking them to change, it's kind of like, well, you don't need to. There's no real reason, because of exactly what you said. Skill acquisition takes time.